The Vikings who assailed the shores of Britain and France were mostly Norwegian or Danish, but Viking adventurers from Sweden were drawn east to the Baltic Sea and beyond. What drove their wanderlust was the dirhem, a high-grade silver coin minted and circulated throughout the vast Abbasid Caliphate. In the 9th century, the Caliphate's wealthy markets teemed with luxury goods. Bulgars and nomadic Khazars from north of the Caspian Sea sold beeswax, honey, furs, and, tragically, slaves to Arab merchants who paid well with silver dirhems. These coins found their way to Sweden and sparked the curiosity of enterprising chiefs.
Kings and Generals is proud to announce that this is one of the many incredible channels that we've partnered up with for Project Ukraine.
On the Swedish island of Gotland, vast silver hoards filled with Arab dirhems confirm the activity of Swedish Vikings trading and plundering in the Baltic and Russia. The Christians of England and France left vivid accounts of their battles with Vikings, but Swedish Vikings in the 9th century mostly encountered peoples without literate cultures. What we know comes largely from Arab travelers and Byzantine chroniclers, but neither dealt with Vikings frequently enough to provide a coherent account of their history. Both were intrigued by the Norse, called the Rus, and left behind fragmentary glimpses of their customs and trade. Snorri Sturluson's Ynglinga Saga describes a series of mythic battles between early Swedish chieftains in which the defeated party often fled to a life of seafaring. These wandering sea kings set out with their warbands for the mysterious East. Snorri even describes the ancient homeland of the Swedes as existing somewhere in the Caucasus. One legend describes a Swedish sea king named Svegdir who braved the Baltic on a quest to find the home of the gods and Odin himself. His journey lasted 5 years and eventually took him to the land of the Turks and Sweden the Great, where he met many kinsmen. During the early 9th century, dragon-headed Viking longships blazed trade routes from the Baltic through the Black and Caspian Seas. Some pressed all the way to Constantinople, capital of the Byzantine Empire, and Baghdad, the hub of the Abbasid Caliphate. The sprawling, glittering city of Constantinople in particular dazzled the Vikings, who called it Miklagard, the Great City. Vikings operating in this eastern world acquired the name Rus. The origins of the term remain mysterious. It may be rooted in the Finnish name for Swedes, or from the Old Norse word for a crew of oarsmen. It could also be rooted in a Byzantine term to describe the blonde hair of Scandinavians. The trade route for the Rus moved first through the Gulf of Finland, up the river Neva, along the southern shores of Lake Ladoga, and on to the river Volkhov. Along this river, the Rus established permanent settlements, Staraya Ladoga, and further south, Novgorod. Novgorod means New Gorod. It sprang up on the north end of Lake Ilhem. Here, archaeologists have found necklaces with pendant hammers, prized by devotees of Thor, amulets with runic inscriptions, and even the small, carved figure of a Valkyrie. The Arab chronicler Ibn Rustar visited this town and estimated its population to number in the thousands. They have no fields, records Ibn Rustar, but simply live on what they get from the Slavs' lands. When a son is born, the father will go up to the newborn baby, sword in hand, and throw it down. "I shall not leave you with any property," he says. "You have only what you can provide for yourself with this weapon." Like their Western cousins, the Swedes were conquerors as well as traders. They seized control of Slavic and Finnish settlements along the river routes and became the ruling elite of a growing network of trading towns. From these bases, the Vikings raided other Finnish and Slavic tribes, extracting tribute in furs and slaves, which the Byzantines and Arabs were always willing to buy. Spring was the trading season, and by autumn, most of the trading convoys had broken up. But when the ground froze, warbands moved more easily overland. Winter was the season for raiding. Our most intriguing early account of the Rus comes from the court of Louis the Pious, Emperor of the Franks and son of Charlemagne. In 839, a Byzantine embassy sent by the Eastern Emperor Theophilus at Constantinople arrived at Louis's court at Ingelheim. The mission of this embassy was to confirm a treaty of alliance between the Western and Eastern emperors. Among the Byzantine diplomats was a band of Viking Rus, who asked for the friendship of Louis. They had with them a letter from Theophilus himself, who requested that the Frankish emperor give the Rus safe passage through his own territories as they travelled back to their home in the north. The Rus explained that by this roundabout diversion, they could avoid certain hostile tribes they'd encountered during their trip from Constantinople. The Frankish annalist tells us that these Rus were of Swedish origin. Louis didn't trust them. The Franks had grown suspicious of Nordic adventurers. Recently, the Rus' Danish cousins had sacked the Frankish port of Dorestad. In replying to the Byzantine emperor, Louis explained that he would detain the Rus at his court for an investigation. If he could confirm that they posed no danger to his lands, he would provide them with the assistance they desired. Otherwise, he would require them to return to Constantinople. Unfortunately, the account ends here. We have no idea what became of these mysterious travelers at the court of Louis the Pious. As the 9th century wore on, the Rus outposts were united into one kingdom. The Russian Primary Chronicle says that the local Slavic tribes, tired of endless internecine warfare, invited the Rus to rule them according to their law. Historian John Haywood calls this improbable to say the least, and the tale is likely a later legend. Rurik, the first Rus prince of the United Settlements, died around 879, succeeded by Oleg the Wise, known as such because he laid the groundwork for state administration. In 882, Oleg organized an army of Vikings and Slavs, struck out from Novgorod, and captured Kiev. He made Kiev his capital, and so was born the kingdom of the Kievan Rus. It's even reported that Oleg made a failed attack against Constantinople in 907, though the Byzantines make no mention of this. What we do know is that around this time the Byzantines afforded trading privileges to the Rus, so favorable that they must have been obtained by some military threat. Rus merchants were allowed to receive food, anchors, and sails for their boats in Constantinople, and granted use of public baths. In return, the Rus paid a fee in silver per ship, but the Byzantines would not allow the Rus to live within the city walls, or to bring in weapons, or to travel about the city without an imperial escort. In 911, the Rus struck a treaty with the Byzantines in which they agreed not to plunder Byzantine ships and to help any Byzantine vessels they found in danger. The treaty also contains stipulations for Rus who wanted to join the imperial army, for the emperor recognized the value of having Vikings in his ranks. Shortly after this treaty, Oleg died. The Primary Chronicle provides us with a whimsical legend of his death that belies his famed wisdom. A soothsayer warned the prince that his favorite horse would cause his death. Oleg therefore refused to ride or even look at the animal. 5 years later, the horse died, and Oleg mocked the soothsayer as a fraud. Recklessly, the prince inspected the bones of the dead animal only to be bitten by a poisonous viper hiding in the skull. Historians are more inclined to believe that he died during a raid on the Caspian Sea. Oleg was succeeded by Igor, who in 941 waged a disastrous attack on Constantinople. His fleet was annihilated by Greek fire launched from the Byzantine galleys, and Igor himself barely escaped being burned to death. In 944, he tried again, but this time the Byzantines bought him off, though on terms far less favorable than the previous trade deal. This setback led Igor to make harsher demands from the local Slavic tribes. In 945, he raided the Drevlians, who counterattacked and captured the Viking chieftain. The Byzantine chronicler Leo the Deacon says that the Drevlians bent down 2 trees, tied each one to one of Igor's legs, and then let them spring apart so that he was torn in 2. Igor's son was still a baby, and so his widow Olga took charge of the Rus state. She vowed revenge on the Drevlians. When they made peace offerings of furs and honey, Olga responded by attacking Iskorosten, modern-day Korostin in Ukraine, utterly destroying the town. Legend says that Olga burned or buried alive Drevlian prisoners. Whatever the case, she was a formidable ruler and preserved the Kievan state until her son assumed the throne in 963. To trade with the Arabs, the Rus Vikings had to travel far beyond their own settlements to Bulgar, some 20 miles downstream from the meeting of the Volga and the Kama rivers. Arab merchants took the Volga River or the Silk Road to Bulgar, where they traded with the Rus for slaves, furs, beeswax, honey, Baltic amber, walrus tusks, falcons, and the prized Frankish swords. Viking grave goods confirm that these Frankish swords, famous for their craftsmanship, were as valued by Scandinavians as they were by the Arabs. From the Arabs, the Rus gained not only silver coin, but silk, spices, perfumes, and beautifully colored ceramic beads that delighted Rus women. The Rus had their own quarter in Bulgar, where they raised wooden dwellings and set up a shrine to their gods. Here, religious rituals were performed, as success in trade was considered a gift of the gods. If trading went well, sheep and cattle were sacrificed in thanks. One Arab visitor to Bulgar was Ibn-Fadlan, who found the Rus fascinating and extensively documented his impressions of them. Ibn-Fadlan generally portrays the Rus negatively as barbaric pagans, but his account also betrays admiration. Medieval writings of the foreign other are notoriously biased, and we have no accounts from the Rus themselves against which to compare Ibn-Fadlan's impressions. He sought to portray the Rus as exotic, strange, and horrifying heathens, and he fashioned his stories to both titillate and repulse the reader. We must treat his writings with caution. Ibn-Fadlan described the Rus as washing daily, but he was disgusted by their use of communal water. He portrays them as mistreating their slaves, although other Muslim writers say that they treated their slaves well. He provides lengthy accounts of Rus sex practices, lingering over each racy detail. Ibn-Fadlan expresses outright admiration for the physical appearance of the Rus. "Never have I seen more perfect bodies than theirs," he wrote. "They are as tall as palm trees, fair and ruddy. They wore cloaks and baggy trousers, and at all times carried an axe, a sword, and a knife. The Rus covered their bodies in tattoos, a practice they adopted from the nomadic Turkic peoples they interacted with in the region." Ibn-Fadlan also expresses admiration for the beauty of Rus women, who adorned themselves with jewelry of silver and gold. He wrote that as soon as a Viking had 10,000 dirhems, he melted them down into a necklace for his wife. The Rus preferred to wear their wealth, both to show it off and to keep it safe. Ibn-Fadlan writes eloquently of the imposing Rus king, who at the time of this account would have been Igor. Seated on a jewel-encrusted throne, Igor was surrounded by 40 beautiful concubines, and was liable to seize any one of them to satisfy his urges right there in public. 400 warriors attended him in his hall, all loyal to their king to the death. Each warrior had one slave girl to wash and dress him and another to act as his bedmate. Most famous of all is Ibn-Fadlan's supposed eyewitness account of a Viking funeral, in which the slave girl of the dead chief is ritualistically debauched and murdered in a brutal human sacrifice. Scholars have long debated the accuracy of this horrific description. Human sacrifice and slavery were a reality in the Viking world, as in much of the pre-modern world, but some historians suggest that parts of the account reflect practices more common among the Turkic-speaking peoples in whose lands the events of the account take place. Could the Rus have adopted some of the customs of the locals? Other scholars believe that Ibn-Fadlan's account is mostly consistent with Norse funerary rites, while others still argue that it reflects traditions that sprang up exclusively among the Rus. Ultimately, we can never be certain of the whole truth. Ship burials were certainly a common feature of pre-Christian Scandinavian culture. At the close of the funeral described by Ibn-Fadlan, the chief's closest male relative walks naked toward the ship, a burning torch in his grasp. He then lights the ship. Others now come forward, each heaping on wood and burning brands. Soon the ship is ablaze. The chief is dispatched to the afterlife. Ibn-Fadlan records how one of the Rus told him the Arabs were wrong to put their loved ones in the ground, where they can be eaten by worms. We burn them in the fire in an instant so that they enter paradise immediately and without delay. This use of the term paradise reflects Ibn-Fadlan's Islamic worldview and must have differed with actual Rus concepts of the next world. Muslims from the period in particular associated the Rus with the veneration of fire. Ibn Sa'id, a 13th century traveller, offers an explanation for his idea that northern peoples worship fire. Nothing seems more important to them than fire, he writes, for the cold in their lands is severe.